From the likes of Beetlejuice to Mars Attacks to even a take on Batman himself, Tim Burton's early career is just littered with extremely odd, unique films with just as strange and interesting characters. But the one that's usually considered his best, even by Burton himself, is Edward Scissorhands, telling the story of a man who was artificially made and stuck in an only half-finished state that's subsequently discovered and marveled at by society, only for things to start going south when people start taking advantage of his kind nature. This is a story that's both all too familiar yet one of a kind at the same time. And today, while trying to stay fair and objective, I'd like to go over Edward Scissorhands and specifically what makes it such a great film, to the best of my amateur abilities. And there will be spoilers for this movie ahead, so if you'd like to see it for yourself first and don't want to know how it ends, please don't proceed any further. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. So to get right into it, where the brilliance of Edward Scissorhands really lies is in its tragic nature, because simply put, with a title and premise of a man with scissors for hands, one is probably either expecting a screwball comedy, a straight-up horror movie, or something in between, like a horror movie with lots of camp. But while Edward Scissorhands has elements of these genres, in the end it's much more a drama than anything else, and any horror to be had most certainly doesn't come from Edward himself, because ultimately, this movie is trying to say that it wasn't the freakish Edward with sharp blades for hands that's the real monster, but rather society and the people who live in it. And that's something that hits a lot closer to home than most would be willing to admit at that. Because at first everybody is fascinated by Edward and treat him like a local celebrity, but due to his lack of social skills and his extremely naive nature, it's not long before people start trying to use him to their own ends and leave him holding the bag when things inevitably go wrong. And the worst part is that Edward just goes along with all of this and doesn't even attempt to defend himself, even though it's clearly shown that he's still very hurt by it all the same. So with that fascination gone and him unfairly labeled a monster, it's not long before everybody turns on him and wants to destroy him for one reason or another, forcing him back into isolation for all eternity, since due to his unfinished state, he is unable to age or die. Now, as I noted in my video on when sad endings are best used, which you can find a link in the description to, this might just be one of the best films ever made to have an almost completely out-and-out tragic ending, especially because it really helps drive home Tim Burton's point about society in the process, because one might just brush off the behavior of the townsfolk as commentary or an exaggeration, but in actuality it's a lot closer to real life than people are comfortable with, because humans naturally have a strong dislike for anybody that isn't like them, and it usually manifests in hostility sooner or later, no matter how undeserving that person is of it. Even when it doesn't happen immediately, people who are considered strange, odd, or have very unusual talents often become the target of fascination by others. But once both the novelty wears off and people try to take advantage of them, suddenly people's penchant for disliking anything that's not normal returns, and they end up driving said person away, or even worse if they feel like it, just like in the film. Some even believe that Tim Burton made the movie partially in response to how Rain Man made the public fascinated with those who have autism, and how in due time such people would go back to being outcasts once they either got tired of them or got what they wanted, just as Edward ultimately is. And what only makes this worse is the type of people who are considered normal against the likes of Edward himself. Because Joyce, for example, is ultimately a creep who completely unjustly accuses Edward of a horrible crime simply because he wouldn't sleep with her, not caring in the slightest what it'll do to his reputation as a result. And yet, this is a woman who's still accepted in her community, a person people will listen to, have conversations with, and be treated as an equal. And that's not even getting into the likes of Jim, because while at first glance a cool jock, in actuality this man is a sociopath that's willing to hurt anyone to get what he wants. And not to mention is extremely possessive towards Kim, who he seems to regard more as a prize than an actual human being. And yet, These people are called normal and held in more esteem than Edward simply because he has scissors for hands and they don't. Now sure, Edward could be dangerous with those hands, but anyone who bothers to actually get to know him knows dang well that he isn't. In actuality, Edward is nothing but an extremely nice and compassionate man who only wants to help those who are nice to him without a thought for himself. In pretty much every possible way, he is the ideal member of society. But just because he looks different, everybody already has a natural bias against him and will never give him a fair chance. Because at first he's viewed by most as something out of a freak show, something for people to marvel at for being different while thinking of ways they can use him. And the second he seems to slip up, suddenly he's to be hated and feared. And as I already noted, what makes it even worse is that Edward never once returns any of this cruelty in kind, only treating everybody nicely as they continue to hurt him more and more. I mean, just look at how far Jim has to push him for Edward to start genuinely lashing out and fighting back. That alone tells you everything you need to know about what kind of man he is, as most would have lost it long before he did. But this even applies to more sympathetic characters as well, because even Kim, who eventually comes to love Edward after being able to see his true inner beauty, at first wants nothing to do with him and simply views him as a freak when the rest of her family took him in and accepted him immediately. Now again, she does come to see him for who he truly is when nobody else will, but it still paints a very accurate picture of society's double standards, because again, people who are horrible on the inside but outwardly appear to be normal members of the community are given a free pass and can do anything they want without judgment or consequences, while the infinitely kind and compassionate Edward has to bear the brunt of their intolerance and bigotry, even as he goes out of his way to help them. And a great example of this is when he saves Kevin, because Jim is the one who chooses to get drunk and drive his van around, and would have probably killed Kevin had Edward not risked his own life pushing him out of the way specifically to avoid that. And yet, everybody gangs up on Edward despite the fact that he just saved his life and the whole thing was Jim's fault. Honestly, considering how things go, it could almost be argued that the attempts by the Boggs to bring Edward into society seem nice but very misguided, as all it does is lead to tragedy and heartbreak when they refuse to accept him. Heck, one could almost argue that the same applies to the scientist who made Edward as well, but one also has to keep in mind that he fully intended on finishing Edward, so it's hard to fault him for wanting to bring something great to life. He's probably even one of the most sympathetic characters in the entire movie, since he's never shown to be anything other than a completely nice and gentle man who wants to do right by his creation, to the point that Edward is probably so nice because of the way he treated him. Though what further adds to the tragedy is the implication that said scientist was himself an outcast for being different as well, and might have even been why he decided to create Edward in the first place. You can even see in his face as he's dying the immense regret he feels for leaving Edward in such a state, as if already knowing what's going to happen to his creation that he might very well have already experienced himself, and is realizing that he just condemned him to the same fate. Really, only Vincent Price could add so much nuance to a character with only a worsening facial expression, because as I noted in a video which you can also find a link in the description to, he was a much better actor than he's often credited for. But getting back to Edward, one can really see how Tim Burton was inspired by the likes of Universal's Frankenstein movies, since, as I went into detail in another video which you can also find a link in the description to, the point of those films is similarly that humanity was the real monster and that the designated monster was simply a creature who was never given a chance due to immediately being branded an abomination that must be destroyed. But what makes Edward Scissorhands even worse is that the monster in Frankenstein is actually shown to be dangerous, if only because he doesn't know any better since he was never taught otherwise and is simply lashing out at the cruelty he has to endure, while Edward never makes a move against anyone, at least intentionally, and is nothing but extremely kind from the very beginning. So the fact that the townspeople turn on him and label him a monster without ever giving him a real chance just only further highlights how bigoted and horrible people can really really be when it comes to those who are different. Now, the fact that some people defend Edward and a couple of the townsfolk even appear to regret their behavior after Jim's death might offer a glimmer of hope, but it also serves to show how people never listen or consider how their actions might hurt others until only after it's too late. And as I noted at the beginning, that's what makes this movie so beautiful. The fact that Tim Burton chooses to embrace the tragedy of the townspeople's behavior full throttle. Because while most would hope that ultimately Edward and Kim can overcome the town's bigotry and show them the error of their ways, in the end their hatred of things that are different and intolerant mindset is just too strong to overcome. So Edward's forced back into hiding and can never see Kim again, who proceeds to grow old with only the memories they have of each other. Frankly, the only thing that keeps it from being out and out tragic is that Kim still lived a good life, and Edward seems at peace despite his isolation and losing the woman he loved. But he's better off that way, because if the likes of Joyce and Jim are called normal while he isn't, then he's better off not being a part of society anyway. They were the problem, not him, and he seems to both know and accept that. So like I've already said, in the end, Edward Scissorhands is the tragic story of how society won't tolerate those they perceive as different, even if the person in question is much better than those who are thought of as normal. And once again, its portrayal of the ugly sides of society and human nature are much more accurate than most would like to admit. And the fact that it ends with society ultimately winning out and leading to a pretty sad ending for all involved only helps drive this point home. Now, some might say that the movie isn't giving people enough credit, but it's not trying to say everybody is that way, and is more a condemnation of society on the whole rather than individual people, as there are those who continue to stand up for Edward until the end. The only problem is that by that point, the townsfolk have succumbed to a mob mentality and won't listen, which is another thing that is simply all too real. To put it simply, I'm not one to give real-world commentaries, so all I'll say is, Tim Burton used this movie to try and hold a mirror up to society and dared us to learn from what we saw. But whether or not he succeeded with that is ultimately up to you to decide. Alright, I think I've more than made my point with this, so now I'd like you to tell me. Do you believe that Edward Scissorhands beautifully shows the evils of society, and specifically how it treats those that are considered different, and that its tragic ending only reinforces that lesson, or do you believe it's way too cynical to get the intended point across? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because remember, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed here just because you watched the video. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you want to, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all really appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.